The World Wrestling Federation, for over 80 years the revolutionary force in sports entertainment, thus meaning that there has been a countless number of video games created that feature the promotion. When it comes to the greatest titles featuring this license, it is easy to turn our attention to the very late 90s and the dawn of the 21st century, as the Nintendo 64 featured WrestleMania 2000 and No Mercy, whereas the Sony systems would feature the critically acclaimed SmackDown series, thus meaning that many people regard this time period as the golden era of WWF wrestling games. Despite this though, there are still further great WWF games that came out many years before all of these. So today we are going to be focusing in on the first really strong effort ever produced. This will include looking at the title's history, discussing what made this one so special, and what separates it from the pack, allowing the game to stand head and shoulders above what came before it. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of WWF Superstars, the first truly brilliant WWF game. Yeah! The year is 1989. Professional wrestling is having one of its hottest and most popular runs of all time. We are just 2 years removed from when Hulk Hogan slammed Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3. And since then, the WWF has somewhat managed to maintain its popularity too. The company were continuing to put out entertaining stuff. This was the year Hulk Hogan would end up facing off against his former friend and partner, Macho Man Randy Savage, at WrestleMania 5. This was the culmination of an epic feud that would see the Mega Powers explode, which basically consisted of the paranoid champion Savage and his partner Hogan getting into a heated argument, with Savage declaring that Hogan was an inferior wrestler to him and that he wanted to steal his wife and manager, Miss Elizabeth too. The soap opera style drama would captivate audiences around the world, leading to one of the most important matchups in the whole entertainment medium. With any successful product marketed towards children, there are of course t-shirts, lunchboxes, toys and more. Further to this, when you take into account this was the 1980s, there was of course video games too. From what I can tell, when it came to console gaming, American firm Acclaim Entertainment, the company who owned LJN from 1989 onwards, owned the license to publish WWF games on home consoles. Over the course of time, this would end up delivering varying results. Some games were average, perfectly playable affairs, whereas others were downright terrible. There was no consistency really, which obviously was partially down to the fact that the company would chop and change which Western development house they would allow to create each instalment. There were even a couple of games developed by Rare in their pre-Silicon Graphics era, which at the very least offered fantastic music composed by David Wise, the man behind the legendary soundtrack of Donkey Kong Country, and more recently, the Ukulele games. We may look at these NES games in more detail in the future, but the more interesting WWF video game stuff was happening away from console gaming. Away from the LJN Acclaim stranglehold, Europe had its own home computer WWF exclusives, known as WrestleMania and European Rampage, that were both published by Ocean, which whilst visually looked a lot more impressive than what Americans could experience on their weak 8-bit consoles, the gameplay was still nothing to shout about. The greatest WWF games from the Hulkamania era never came from the US or Europe, but instead Japan, and the games even saw worldwide release as they were developed for the arcade format, rather than the home, which meant they could coexist alongside LJN's console exclusives. It was common in the 1980s and 1990s for terrible American game publishers to release absolutely crap console games based off of popular film and television licenses. This is the reason it is common for great Japanese arcade games existing which seemed like they inexplicably didn't make it home. Some games like Turtles in Time did make it home because Konami held the console and arcade rights to the Turtles franchise. But the likes of The Simpsons and X-Men remained trapped in the arcades due to LJN holding the licenses to both The Simpsons and X-Men games in the homes, meaning that home console gamers were stuck with absolute crap, even though much better games existed featuring the licenses. WWF Superstars, which we are looking at today, falls into the exact same category as both The Simpsons and X-Men. in that it was the greatest game to exist carrying a particular license, but LJN made its home release a complete impossibility. But gamers who ventured out to the likes of bowling alleys, roller rinks, kebab shops and more could experience the most delightful WWF game produced yet. WWF Superstars was both developed and published by a Japanese company known as Technos Japan, a company who had made a huge impact in the arcades by producing the likes of Renegade and the Double Dragon series, games that would help shape the entire gaming landscape and influence many great games to come. In this wrestling game's case, the project was led by Yoshihisa Kishimoto, the same man behind the brilliant games we just mentioned. When it comes to Technos, apart from publishing the first great beat-em-ups and arguably the first true fighting game too with Karate Champ, wrestling was a further combat genre the company would make huge strides in. Prior to WWF Superstars, the company had already made a ton of progress developing and releasing tag team wrestling, followed by Mat Mania, followed by the cheekily named Mania Challenge. But now, with WWF Superstars, Technos Japan finally had a wrestling game with the WWF license attached to it, meaning that this game was the most marketable yet. Back in 1989, Superstars was by far the flashiest WWF game ever created, and had far more bells and whistles than any game that was released on the NES, or hell, even the Super Nintendo or Mega Drive either. In this game, players pick two wrestlers and form a tag team, and embark on a quest to both win and defend the tag team championships. This thus means that every match is a tag team match, players, meaning that secretly over in WCW, Teddy Long was playing this game every single night. Holla holla holla! The lineup of playable wrestlers is a small one, which is to be expected in 1989, but a choice of 6 playable characters is not bad at all considering that this game was released in a pre-Street Fighter II world. Out of these 6 we have some who simply had to be included too. We have of course Hulk Hogan, the very face of professional wrestling itself. We have Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan's tag team partner and WrestleMania opponent that year, and we have the Ultimate Warrior, a man who would later go on to defeat Hogan at WrestleMania, who was quickly becoming one of the most loved competitors in the company. Further to this, we have Jim Duggan, a further firm fan favourite. And also we have the dastardly villain and longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time, the bloody Honky Tonk Man, the comedic, arrogant wrestler slash Elvis impersonator. He was quality. Finally, from the playable roster lineup, we have Big Boss Man, a character inspired by his previous career as a corrections officer. His memorable look made him a good pick for wrestling games at the time, but his in-ring career was pretty hot at the time too, attacking Hogan on television, leading to him and his tag team partner Akeem facing off against the Mega Powers. So all in all, the 6 playable wrestlers were 6 who made sense. The goal of the game is to take your team through a series of matches that take place in both New York City and Tokyo, 2 wrestling hubs of the 1980s, making the game more relatable to both Western and Japanese gamers alike. Gameplay in this title is simple and intuitive, just as it should be, and revolves around a basic grappling and attack system. Once a grapple is executed, players have the ability to toss their opponents, whip them against the ropes, or put them in a headlock to pull off character-specific moves. This means that each character is different and can perform their signature moves, of which they are most known for performing on television, allowing players to more accurately live out their pro wrestling fantasies. Control over wrestlers is what this game is all about really, and the way you could control each character was marvellous compared to other WWF offerings. This arcade game allowed players to perform standing strikes, running attacks, running counter attacks, ground attacks, and even perform moves from atop a ring post. A referee is even present in the ring to add to the authenticity, however sadly he cannot be attacked or affected by the in-ring action, meaning that silly pro wrestling shenanigans are unfortunately not possible here. The game still offers a lot of freedom though. Wrestlers can even leave the ring and brawl around the outside, and the announcer's table can be picked up and swung around as a weapon, adding to the overall grappling experience. To add to the mayhem, both you and your opponent's tag team partners will join the brawl on the outside, bringing another element of chaotic fun to the game. In some cases, a partner will even walk off screen and return with a steel bloody chair to wield as a weapon, adding a further layer to the game. In scenarios where fights on the outside occur, wrestlers must return to the ring before the end of a 20 count, otherwise they can lose a bout by countout. Prior to even starting the game, the title shows some fully voiced scenes depicting the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, Andre the Giant and Virgil, who are being interviewed by Mean Gene Okerlund, brother. These scenes are very cool to see, however sadly they are clearly not voiced by their real life counterparts. But what you gonna do? So let me tell you something, brother. The $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase and Andre the Giant were a team from the 1980s that formed who were called themselves the Mega Bucks, who deliberately formed a team to go up against the Mega Powers, Hogan and Savage. Ooh yeah. These two gentlemen, who were some of the biggest villains in the promotion at the time, are challengeable after winning 3 consecutive matches in this arcade game. They basically function in boss style roles similar to the likes of Bison in Street Fighter 2 that would come along later. This means they are more difficult to wrestle against than other opponents. For example, most grappling moves foul against Andre due to his sheer size and power, which once again is a lovely touch to make this game emulate the WWF product on TV further. If players are successful in defeating these tougher opponents, a scene is shown featuring a newspaper headline that heralds the players as tag team champions. From here though, the game is not truly over, as players must wrestle against each tag team all over again, including the Megabucks, to prove once and for all who the true tag team champions are. The game finally draws to a close when each team has been defeated in total twice. Speaking of these teams, whilst only 6 wrestlers are accessible to players in this arcade game, using cheats on MAME allows players to experience playing the game as both DiBiase and Andre. However, there are some caveats to this, such as the game thinking the player loses if they win by submission, along with some graphical errors too. But nothing to complain about when you consider that this function is an exploit. Despite overall being a fairly limited experience compared to wrestling games that would come later, for a 1980s title, this was a very decent WWF game. I suppose a good way to describe what can be found in this title is that it took some of the fun and some of the graphical style that could be found in the Double Dragon series and applied it to wrestling, which overall worked great. If you have watched some of my other recent videos, you will see that Capcom did the same thing when they released Saturday Night Slam Masters, emulating some of the graphics and gameplay found in Street Fighter 2. However, obviously WWF Superstars is 4 years older than Slam Masters, so in many ways the two games are equally as impressive for the times they were released. As some of you will probably know though, WWF Superstars was not even Technos Japan's most impressive WWF game, as this title was just the first, and later they would produce WWF WrestleFest, a game that would wow consumers even more. But that's obviously a deep dive I'll consider doing if this video finds an audience. Let me know down below if you are interested in hearing me give coverage to that one too. In terms of WWF Superstars legacy though, this was the first instance that demonstrated that the Japanese were more capable at the time of developing wrestling games than any company in the West. Years later, after the Acclaim LJN publishing rights expired for releasing WWF console games, we would see a wrestling game renaissance when publishing rights were given to another American company, this one known as THQ. During the wrestling game Golden Age we mentioned at the start of the video, the THQ SmackDown games, released on Sony hardware, were developed by Yuke's, a company with many years experience creating the critically acclaimed Shin Nippon Pro Wrestling titles in Japan. And the THQ Nintendo 64 games were developed by the Aki Corporation, a Japanese firm who had already developed some decent WCW titles and Virtual Pro Wrestling 64. It seems like the WWF would learn a lot through their dealings with both Acclaim's LJN and their experience with the Technos arcade game. There are so many great Japanese developed wrestling games which we can perhaps discuss on here down the line too. God bless Japan. Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of WWF Superstars, the first brilliant WWF game. Let me know in the comment section down below if you are keen for me to cover more wrestling game history down the line, and if there is one particular game you would like me to cover in detail. Please be sure to let me know. Today's video was chosen by a democratic process by the wonderful people who back this channel on Patreon, who have ensured that I can continue to run this channel full time even though the pandemic has resulted in advertising revenue no longer being a viable sole source of income. Your love for what I do has allowed me to continue what I love to do, meaning that I can continue to release multiple weekly in-depth videos. If you want to help choose what content I work on, want early access to all of my videos, want to chat to me and others on Discord, then consider backing the Top Hat Gaming Man channel on Patreon. Everyone's got a price. You have no idea how much I appreciate what you do for me. Speaking of Patreon backers, huge thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, Heyo, Paula Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, Rowan Dinched, Evan Balder, Philip Mampf, Cambo Ranro 82, A Murder of Crows, Azrael Warakai, Keith Ferguson, Joaquin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, SpongeMat B, Glenny Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of the Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Instant Gratification Monkey, James Bishop, JB, Post DXL, Michael Hall, Barbara Kitty, Ron Stubb, Chesty LaRue, Langston Miller, Noob, Casey Wright, Zai, Brian Barry, Selagny, Chris Margarine, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Lamik Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Punky Tombstone, Matthew Windle, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Marco Soto, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Jazzy Tay, Crazy Yarl, Master Jinx, Hans Christian, Time Lord Soundwave, Dan Van Dam, Adam Casting, Gregory Smoradric, Squick 67, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Angry Little SOB, Mike Bruno, Andis Reinsbergs, Chris Fisk, Ivan M, Paul Elliott, Me Machine Dean, Antonio Rodriguez, Dan Barlow Jr., Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroverse.com, Synth Spaces, and Andrew Bezansky. Thank you to everybody who bloody backs this channel. You are my blood. Yeah.